video is brought to you by HelloFresh. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time, and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1957, 31-year-old Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend. And she would tell him, I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea? And Larry would tell her, you know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine. And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, and he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group, and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie? And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago. And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you. But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, no, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle. Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry. And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, this is our brother. And so they approached him and they said, look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother. And we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us. And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken and we can put this behind us. And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, you are Larry Bader. When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, like, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best. But as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson, he's on TV, hey Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it, they came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that 1, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And 2, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back during the beginning of the pandemic, we were not able to get groceries or have food delivered to our house. And so before long, we were down to eating just the Diet Cheetos and pickled licorice. And as I was eating my 77th bag of Diet Cheetos, I thought to myself, is there anything better for me to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh. HelloFresh is like one of those things where as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, how could I have ever lived without this? They send you this neat little box full of meals, and there's all these incredible meals to choose from fairly intricate to very quick and easy. And so whatever your tastes are, they got it. But the catch is, they are not made. You are the chef, and you make the meals. And before you tell me that you're a bad chef, I'm a bad chef, and I'm able to whip these meals together no problem because all the ingredients are perfectly proportioned, which also means you don't waste any food, and the recipes are incredibly easy to follow. So the end product is home-cooked, fresh, delicious food every time. So if your New Year's resolution is to eat better or to just stop snarfing as many Diet Cheetos, then you really need to sign up for HelloFresh. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com, use the code MrBallen's16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by, this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, "Come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group." And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. "Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group." And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other, speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, home. And then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him. And very quickly, they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism. And so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted, and as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows, and outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up, and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on, and eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. And so that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. This story is totally unbelievable. It's shocking. It's a whole bunch of things. But what you'll remember from this story is the twist at the very end. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please open all the cans of tuna fish inside the like button's pantry and then release a gang of feral cats into their house. And then release a gang of vicious feral cats inside their house. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On June 25th, 1950, the Korean War broke out between the North Koreans and the South Koreans. Just 2 days after this war had begun, the United States formally entered the conflict by sending troops to aid the South Koreans. Shortly after this, the United States enacted a military draft. A military draft is the forced enlistment of civilians into the military. In the Korean War, the way Americans were chosen was in a lottery, and if their name was called, they would have to stop whatever they were doing in the civilian world and immediately go serve their country, and if they refused, they would go to jail. An 18-year-old high school dropout nicknamed Samson was living with his family in Seattle, Washington when he found out he had been drafted. While military service was not something Samson was considering for his future, he accepted his fate with grace, and before long, he was making his way to Fort Ord in Northern California to begin his military training. But after training, when Samson was now officially a soldier in the army, he was not sent to Korea to fight in the war. Instead, he was ordered to stay at Fort Ord and be the lifeguard for their pool. It's unclear how Samson felt about this, but regardless, he did his duty, and he stayed at this pool and he minded the folks who went swimming, and then at night and on the weekends, he would earn some extra cash by being a bouncer at a local bar. A year later, Samson was still working at the Fort Ord pool when he decided to take some time off and go back home to Seattle and see his family and see his girlfriend. As a military member, Samson was able to fly for free on any military flight so long as he was in uniform. And so Samson packed up his things, he threw on his uniform, and he made his way over to the Fort Ord airport, where he hopped on a small military plane and he flew to Seattle. A few days later, on September 30th, 1951, Samson said goodbye to his family and to his girlfriend, and then he put his uniform back on and made his way to the Seattle airport. When he got there, he saw there was only one military plane that was flying from Seattle all the way down to Fort Ord, and this plane was a World War II era dive bomber that only had enough space for one person, the pilot. Samson had to get back to Fort Ord that night because the following day he had work, and in the army you can't just not show up for work. But Samson didn't have enough money to buy a civilian plane ticket to take a civilian flight down to Fort Ord, so he was in a tough spot. And so he approaches this pilot of this dive bomber plane, and he says, hey, can I just cram into your radar compartment in the back of your plane? And the pilot, whose name was Anderson, immediately said, no, that's a terrible idea. It's not meant for passengers. It's barely big enough to fit inside of. You could get badly hurt in there. But Samson was adamant that he had to get back that night, that he'd be in so much trouble if he didn't. And he kind of appealed to Anderson and said, look, you're in the military. You get it. I have to get back there tonight. Can you please make an exception and just let me hitch a ride in the back of your plane? And so finally, against his better judgment, Anderson caves and he says, okay, Samson, you can come with me. And so a little bit before 4 p.m. that afternoon, Samson eagerly went around to the side of the plane. He opened up a side hatch and he crawled inside of this very tight radar compartment. And once he was tucked up inside, Anderson walked around and he closed the hatch behind him. And then Anderson got in the cockpit and began preparing the plane for takeoff. A few minutes later, the pair was careening down the runway, and right as the plane began to experience lift and was going up into the air, the side hatch of the radar compartment where Samson was suddenly flew open. The big issue with this now open door in the radar compartment was not that Samson, like in the movies, would get sucked out this door out to his death, although if he wasn't careful, he totally could fall out of the door. No, the real problem with this now open door had to do with oxygen levels. At their cruising altitude, where the majority of their flight would be spent, there wasn't enough oxygen in the air to sustain human life. And so as soon as Anderson powered up that plane and began preparing it for takeoff, he began pumping oxygen into the cockpit and also into the radar compartment space. This is done specifically to compensate for the lack of oxygen up at that cruising altitude. But with Samson's door now wide open, all that extra oxygen that was coming into that space to keep him alive is now just being sucked right out the door into the atmosphere, which meant if Samson couldn't find a way to shut that door, he would eventually pass out and suffocate to death. Samson, who was fully aware of this fact, immediately jumped into action by anchoring his feet and legs around the stanchion in the middle of this compartment space, and once he was fairly secure, he began extending his upper body out of the plane to try to grab onto the handle to try to shut it. But once he was holding onto that door handle, he's now halfway out of the plane, he could not get it to shut. The wind was so strong it was pinning the door open. And so for the next several minutes, Samson desperately is trying to get this door shut, but it's not working. And so eventually he retreated back into the plane and went all the way to the very back of the radar compartment space and tucked himself up behind some equipment. Because this was not an area where passengers were supposed to be, there was no way to communicate with the pilot. He could not tell Anderson that he was dying back here. And so he just sat there and prayed. While Samson was dealing with this open door crisis, Anderson was dealing with a crisis of his own. At some point after takeoff, he looked down at his gauges and he realized a terrible mistake had been made. There wasn't enough fuel to get to Fort Ord, and where he was discovering it, where he was out over the water, there wasn't enough fuel to even turn around and go back to Seattle. And so Anderson grabs his radio and he tries to call out to these surrounding airports to see if there's anywhere he can just emergency land this plane, but all he hears is silence. It would turn out his radio equipment just happened to fail right at this moment. And what also happened to fail right at that moment was Anderson's oxygen supply. It had nothing to do with Samson and the open door. Anderson just also suddenly was without oxygen. And so Anderson knew he had to get to a lower altitude as fast as possible because he would eventually pass out and crash the plane. And so he went into a very steep dive and began going down and realized he needed to try to land this plane in the ocean now. There was no way he could get to an airport. And so he's burning down towards the water, and as they're coming down in altitude, there was more oxygen in the air. And so Samson, who had eventually passed out from a lack of oxygen, is suddenly revived with all this additional oxygen as they're going down. And so Samson comes to, and he looks, and the door is still wide open, and all he can see is the Pacific Ocean burning up at him. He only had a few seconds to grab onto the stanchion in the middle of the space he's in before they impacted the water. Miraculously, Samson survived the impact, but immediately he was faced with another life and death situation. Because this door was wide open, the freezing cold water began pouring inside, flooding the space. And so Samson tried to swim his way out, but the power of this water coming in was too strong, and so he had to wait until the space completely flooded before he swam out and then swam up to the surface. Once he got to the surface, he's looking around and the water's incredibly choppy and it's very foggy. He can barely see anything. And he's looking around for Anderson, not really sure what happened to him, and he looks down the plane towards the front of the plane and he sees Anderson climbing out of the cockpit. He looks badly beaten up, but he's alive. He's okay. And so Samson yells to him and the two men link up and they're able to pull 2 life rafts out of the plane. And so both men, they get into each of their rafts right as this plane sinks down below the surface. And so Anderson and Samson begin looking around, wondering what they're going to do, but it's so foggy, they can't see land in any direction. They can barely see 10 feet away from themselves. And so Anderson thought they landed maybe 2 or 3 miles off the coast of California, but they weren't really sure. So Anderson pulled out his compass, he looked east and said, let's just start paddling. The men had crashed about 2 miles off the coast of Point Reyes, California, which is this big protected shoreline that's about 150 miles north of Fort Ord. And this particular stretch of water that these two men had found themselves in was a known breeding ground for great white sharks. So the two men, they got their compass and they're trying to swim as fast as they can to the east, but they're not seeing any land. The fog hasn't let up at all. And then eventually it got dark. And as soon as it got dark, the water got choppier and choppier until at one point, Samson actually was launched out of his raft into the water. He turned around and saw his raft, but it was being pulled away by a current faster than he could swim to it. And so Samson yells out for Anderson, who sees him in the water. Anderson tries his best to paddle over and save Samson, but the current was too strong. And before long, Samson watched as Anderson just disappeared into the fog. Now, Samson was all alone in the middle of the night. He couldn't see anything. There's no land anywhere. He doesn't have the compass. Anderson had the compass, so he has no idea which direction is what. He's in a shark breeding ground, and now he doesn't have his life raft. And so Samson did the only thing he could do, which was pick a direction that he believed was east and start swimming. And so Samson is swimming in this pitch black water. He can't see anything around him. And all he's probably thinking about is how any minute now, I'm going to run out of energy and I'm going to sink down and I'm going to drown, or I'm going to get attacked by sharks, or some combination of the two. But miraculously, after about an hour of swimming in some direction, he broke through the fog and he saw way off in the distance was a light on what looked like dry land. And so he has this sudden burst of energy and he swims as hard and as fast as he possibly can. A couple of times he gets pulled under by rip currents and he nearly drowns, but eventually he gets to the sandy shores of Point Reyes. It's believed he swam approximately 1 or 2 miles after being dumped out of the boat. As he was pulling himself out of the water and collapsed on the beach, he had given everything to that swim. Had he been in the water for even a few more minutes, it's very likely he would have drowned. Unable to stand from pure exhaustion, Samson just began slowly crawling up the beach towards this light he had seen as he was swimming. And it would turn out this light was on the outside of this building that was owned by a radio station. And so Samson is crawling and periodically puking out seawater. And finally, after about 30 or 45 minutes, he gets to the steps of this building. He crawls up the steps and he pounds on the door. And by this point, he's hypothermic, he's in shock. He's about to die if he doesn't get any help. And luckily, there's someone inside of this building. They open it up, they see Samson. They don't know what's going on, but they pick him up, they pull him inside, they wrap him in a blanket, and they try to ask him, what happened? What's going on? Why are you here? But Samson was too cold to even speak, so he just sat there and shook. And so finally, this employee just called the Coast Guard that had a station very close to where they were. And a few minutes later, the Coast Guard shows up, they take Samson, and they rush him to their station house where they were able to give him medical treatment, which saved his life. It was also at this Coast Guard station where Samson was reunited with Anderson, who had also managed to make his way to shore alive. Samson would go on to serve for 2 more years in the Army. The entire time was spent as a lifeguard at the Fort Ord pool. Then in 1953, after the Korean War ended, Samson's mandatory service came to an end and he was honorably discharged. Samson would go on to become one of the most successful and well-known actors and producers of all time. He has won hundreds of big awards, including 4 Academy Awards and 4 Golden Globe Awards. Samson's real name is Clint Eastwood. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please open all the cans of tuna fish in the like button's pantry and then proceed to let loose a vicious gang of feral cats in their house. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise, so if you want to buy flannels and hats and a whole bunch of stuff, go to shopmrballen.com. Also, go follow our shop's Instagram page for all upcoming deals and promotions. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Around 3 a.m. on September 5th, 1981, a woman drove through a housing development in Lakeland, Florida. With her was her 2 friends, who had both agreed to spend the night at her duplex. And for this woman, this was a massive relief, because the idea of spending a night alone in her house right now was just terrifying, because the night before, there had been a murder committed right nearby. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and hide open cans of tuna in all their vents, and then turn on the heat at full blast. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before 8 p.m. on September 3rd, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton stood in her kitchen in Lakeland, Florida, staring into her cupboard. It was almost completely empty, except for a few cans of beans and a bag of flour. And seeing this gave Linda a pit in her stomach, because she knew she would somehow have to turn these sparse ingredients into a meal for her kids. Linda was a single mother of 2 boys, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And Linda didn't have very much money. And so in order to take care of her kids, she had to be resourceful. Like, finding a way to make food with whatever ingredients she had, and she also would make her kids their own clothing. Anything to save money. Now, up until a few weeks ago, the family had lived in Alabama. But Linda had moved to Lakeland specifically because she had a lot of family and support there. And so Linda had hoped that, because of that support, that, her and her son's lives would, improve quite a bit. It wouldn't feel like such a struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the move to Lakeland had just been more of the same. Linda couldn't find a steady job, so she and the boys had been relying on government assistance and food stamps, which never seemed to be enough to keep these 2 teenagers well fed. And tonight, Linda's youngest son, Tim, was about to be dropped off after being at football practice. And historically, he was very hungry after practice, and so she really wanted to have dinner ready for him. And on top of that, Linda was hopeful that Tim and her other son Jeff would eat fast enough that they would have enough time to make it to a neighbor's housewarming party later that night. So all the neighbors around Linda were basically as new as she was, since the complex they lived in had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was the sprawling development with about 80 one-story duplexes that were technically government-subsidized housing, but it felt more like classic suburbia, since the units were on cul-de-sacs with neat lawns where all the kids would go outside and play. Now, Linda's sister also lived in this complex, so Linda already knew at least one person. But to Linda, making friends of her own was also pretty important to her. She was an outgoing person by nature, and also she was newly single and wanted to take her mind off her ex-boyfriend. Until recently, Linda had been dating this guy named Brendan Fowler, who had been great at first and was even the one who told her about this apartment complex. But he'd started to get really controlling and possessive, and just 2 days ago, Linda had finally ended things. But believe it or not, Linda actually felt sort of hopeful. She had believed that by leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this complex, that would sort of be the refresh that she and her kids desperately needed. But the truth was, it sort of seemed like actually the true reset had been the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. like it all needed to happen, all this big change, in order for their lives to really get on the right track. And so, feeling optimistic, Linda looked into the cupboard at her limited ingredients and suddenly realized she could actually do a quick bean casserole with just these couple of things. So she grabbed the cans and the flour, and she got started. About a half an hour later, Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen to see if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but they needed to wait for Tim to get home from football first. And when she said that, Jeff sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and there was basically no food in the house, and so he couldn't even eat anything else to tide himself over, like, come on, let me eat. Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad, but at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. I mean, Jeff had been talking back to her a lot lately, and the two of them seemed to fight all the time. Linda knew he was sort of just being a typical teenager, and he was really hungry, and so he's testing her limits. But she was just getting really sick of it. And so before she could even really think about it, she snapped back at him and said, well, if you don't like it here, you can leave. And at that, Jeff literally stormed out of the house and slammed the door behind him. Linda went to the window and watched her son pick up his bike and pedal off down the road. After that, Linda sighed and walked over to her phone and called her mom. She assumed, Jeff, her son, would go to her parents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up, Linda warned her that Jeff might be there soon and he'd likely want to eat. Her mom said that was fine and they would drop him back off after dinner. Then her mom said she actually was glad that Linda called because another letter came. And as soon as Linda heard that, she felt this wave of anxiety come over her because she knew what kind of letter she was talking about. So Linda's ex-husband and Tim and Jeff's dad, Frank Slayton, lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they'd been divorced for 7 years. But Frank had never stopped harassing Linda after they broke up. And since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had been mailing threatening letters to Linda's parents, saying that Linda had ruined his life. And so now Linda was thinking, no matter how many fresh starts she started, that Frank was always going to screw them up. He was never going to go away. And so after taking a calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to read it. Not long after she hung up, her younger son, Tim, came in the front door. He was all sweaty and dirty from football practice, and right away, Linda asked him, hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home? And Tim said, yes, I did. So Linda, she didn't have a car because she couldn't afford one, and so Tim's coach always had to give him a ride, but Tim said, I thanked him like always. And so Linda told him to hurry up and eat because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim walked home from the party through the dark apartment complex. There were 7 other people who had been at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. Everybody just drank iced tea and played cards while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex, like the great business district across the street and how responsive the maintenance team was. So Linda was glad they went. She was also exhausted, and her sister always came over for coffee in the morning, so she needed to go to bed now or she would never wake up. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and opened up the door, Linda froze because there was already somebody inside. For a second, she thought it might be an intruder, but then she realized it was actually just her older son, Jeff, who had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a sort of I'm sorry expression on his face. Tim saw the situation and immediately disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and brother some space. Linda went to join Jeff in the kitchen, but Jeff didn't say anything. So Linda spoke first and reminded him that it was not good to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. And Linda knew from experience with her son, it was better not to force Jeff to talk. So she decided she would just give Jeff a minute, and she began washing the dishes. Finally, after a few moments, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom, and Linda smiled. She felt relieved they could just move on from this. She said it was all good and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight, and Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept, and then Linda wrapped up in the kitchen, turned off the lights, and headed into her own bedroom, closed the door, and she went to bed too. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up to Linda's duplex. They'd had coffee together every morning since they moved to the neighborhood, so Judy expected to knock on her sister's door and go right in like she always did. But this time after she knocked, nobody answered. So Judy waited and then knocked again. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and tried to open up the door, but she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out in response. But Judy wasn't really worried. She just assumed, that Linda must have overslept or something. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few minutes, and eventually she would call to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she walked away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's house. One of the back windows was missing a screen, and Judy knew that that particular room was Linda's bedroom, and it hadn't been like that yesterday. So seeing it now made her feel kind of uneasy, and so she went over to look inside. And when she looked inside, she saw her sister fast asleep in bed. And for a second, Judy was relieved, because this confirmed that this is all this was. Her sister had overslept, that's that. But then Judy realized there was something off about Linda, like the way she was positioned just seemed wrong. And when everything clicked for her, she staggered backwards and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on September 4th, 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers surrounded the duplex in a Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under some crime scene tape and headed to the home's walkway with a bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. So Pickett was actually just a year away from retirement after 2 decades as a detective, and for the last few years, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit, which meant he oversaw the collection and documentation of evidence at crime scenes. And so he wasn't the lead investigator on this case, but when it came to forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation and knew that this was very likely a homicide, and the victim had been identified as 31-year-old Linda Slayton. Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had asked a nearby maintenance worker to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responder got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep and appeared to have no idea their mother was deceased in the next room, which Pickett knew would give investigators somewhat of a timeline to start with. Linda was clearly awake when her kids went to sleep and must have died sometime during the night while her kids were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway, he passed by 2 teenage boys sitting in their pajamas on the ground. He assumed these must be the sons, and one of them just sort of stared ahead, seemingly in complete shock, while the other sort of sobbed into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if anybody had spoken to them yet, but he knew they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they'd know the habits and patterns of everybody who lived there, and might be able to tell him if anything seemed out of place. So Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators inside about that. Then he looked at the house and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of the crime scene before he did any actual collections. So before he would go in, he would walk around the entire house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the police first got there. And from what he could see, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and spent some time dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there, or any noticeable shoe impressions in the dirt outside. And then when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the officers and detectives that were already in there and went straight to the bedroom. And the first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed with a metal coat hanger wrapped around her throat. The sheets around her were covered in blood, and she was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up. And when Pickett got closer, he saw where the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches on Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her nails as she tried to pry the hanger away. He'd have to wait for the autopsy, but it was clear from her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also been likely sexually assaulted. Pickett stepped back and looked around the room, trying to decide where to start. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as possible. So the first thing he did was try and guess what happened and how the killer might have interacted with the crime scene. That way, he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention. He figured the killer must have come in through the open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. Linda's purse and jewelry were still on the dresser, and the drawers were all closed, as opposed to open and rifled through, so it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this likely was not a robbery gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done was come in through the window and attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any signs of a struggle. So Linda was likely caught off guard by a very fast attack and unable to really fight back quickly, because if she did, the room would be a huge mess. But then Pickett caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed the clothes were all hanging on metal hangers that looked identical to the one that was around Linda's neck. And that's when it hit him. The killer must have at some point been in the closet, hiding. He supposed the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger once the attack started, but that would have taken too much time and also given Linda a chance to get off the bed or fight back or yell out and maybe wake her sons up. It was much more likely that the killer had broken in earlier, hid in the closet, and then waited until Linda was in her bed asleep to come out and attack. If Pickett was right about that, this became definitely a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or had been watching her, since they would have known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear and began thinking how he was going to begin looking for evidence. He figured he would start at the window and spend some time there, and then he would go to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas. And so once he had that plan in mind, he went to the window and he began looking for evidence, and sure enough, after only a few minutes of dusting, he smiled. Because there, on the ledge, was a very clear, well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab, comparing two sets of prints with a magnifying glass. He'd been at it for hours already, so his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene yesterday, Pickett had gone back to the station to review the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the detectives to get an update on the case. And what they would tell him is they had spoken to the neighbors, as well as Linda's family, and they did have a few solid leads and a timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff got dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. And Tim, the younger son, and Linda had gotten back from a neighbor's party just after 11 p.m. They all went to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers heard anything until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene, that Linda's attack was very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or it would have woken up her sons. The autopsy report had also come in, and it confirmed Linda died from strangulation and was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect semen from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a man here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners. She had her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and an ex-boyfriend named Brendan Fowler. Frank apparently had abused Linda when they were married and still sent her very threatening letters. And Brendan was apparently very possessive with a bad temper, and Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. And so some officers were already out looking for both of these men, and Pickett was eager to get both of their prints. But for now, Pickett was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their canvass initially, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were suspects. And so Pickett had collected fingerprints from all the men at that party who didn't have an alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, comparing those prints to the print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none were a match, but they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, and so Pickett would have to test those as well. So in 1981, DNA testing didn't exist yet, but investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those samples against the genetic material found on Linda's body and rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another reason for wanting to be diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because after Linda's murder, like in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors had called in to say a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was gone by the time the police arrived, they could see her back door had clearly been forced open. And then another neighbor had called in to say that the screen on their window was pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like Linda's, but the timing was very suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living in the complex. The department had ordered some patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about. So he was working with his radio right next to him. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty tired and would need a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing outside of an interrogation room, listening as some detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell by his voice that he was not happy to be here. He sounded argumentative and defensive as he insisted he really had nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the whole night. He even gave detectives his mom's phone number and said they should call her to confirm it. Pickett heard the detectives confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test and let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, yeah, go ahead. And as soon as Pickett heard that, based on experience, he went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind. On September 11th, so 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the newspaper, and what he saw made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he admitted they would not be making an arrest now or in the next few days. And reading that in print reminded Pickett of just how little they had in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill, and they'd tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but found that he was in Alabama on the night Linda was killed. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first because during his polygraph, the results had been inconclusive, and his alibi didn't check out. His family had said he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they all went to sleep and couldn't say for sure if maybe he left or not. But when Pickett had looked at his prints, he had no choice but to clear him, because they clearly were not a match. So now Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for leads, which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his paper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him, and it was Linda's own 15-year-old son, Jeff Slayton, and he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his mother's murder, and had already been questioned a few times. Detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members mentioned that, Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot before she died. And when investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's room. So it was strange he hadn't heard anything on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that he and his mother's fights were not that serious, and they did fight the night she died, but it was over some dumb argument over what time dinner was. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked, because he wished he had so he could have gone in there and helped her. And also Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff, and Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid, because he thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own, and from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed sort of like typical teenage behavior, squabbling with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker broke in through the window, which didn't make sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he lifted from the window, and he knew it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. maybe it was even a stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, partner, or friend, which was why he assumed the detectives weren't pursuing it. But through his forensics, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everybody in Linda's life who had a motive or opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was very outgoing. Pickett thought it was possible the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed possible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave, he tried to go back to the newspaper, but he kept thinking about Linda. He'd been sure this case would be solved quickly by forensics, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed, and it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he left the precinct for the last time, he sort of had a pit in his stomach, because he had a feeling that without him, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, so 2 decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, Detective Brad Grice sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department reading over Linda's cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grice had been sorting through the department's cold cases and choosing which ones to reopen. And this had been a really slow process, because he had to do that and juggle his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been working on Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much, since the whole reason this case appealed to him was because he was sure he could solve it quickly. Because it had DNA evidence. So back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through blood type. But now, in 2001, Bryce could use that same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. And he intended on reaching out to everybody involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did this, he wanted to familiarize himself with the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters around the time of her murder. And then her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, was known to have a bad temper and seemed very controlling of Linda. And they broke up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so somebody could have maybe followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been too, but Jeff actually admitted to getting in a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared through fingerprints, alibi, or polygraphs. But Grice knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those 3 things, DNA overrode that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He'd already decided that, basically no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the 2 people who'd known Linda better than anybody else. Her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grice walked into a meeting room at the precinct, where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting. And as soon as he saw the brothers, he just started laughing, because he realized he knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together for years, but it hadn't occurred to Grice that this Jeff was that Jeff. And Jeff recognized Grice at the same time. So they spent a while talking and laughing about what a crazy coincidence this was. And so when Grice finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim at the same time, Grice's first line of questioning was actually just pretty emotional. It just was like, hey, how are you guys holding up after this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood got pretty heavy as the 2 brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been. After their mother had been killed, they both said they were terrified that, they were going to get hurt too, because the killer was never caught. They felt like, who's next? Jeff said he slept with a knife under his pillow, and he eventually got so depressed, he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted he also struggled, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and friends for support and kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grice that, Tim and Jeff didn't really have any information he didn't already have inside the case file. So instead of continuing to question them about details of the case, Grice explained that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect samples from every person involved in this case, which included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then said, of course. So Grice stood up and said he would send a tech inside. But before he left, he promised them that he would find their mom's killer, and he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grice sat in front of a screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the two Slayton brothers, Grice had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case from 1981. Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband Frank Slayton and her ex-boyfriend Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the blood samples that the original investigators got from Linda's neighbors, but none of them matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer, which was disappointing because it meant that Grice had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the case notes, he noticed the mention of break-ins around the complex shortly after Linda's murder, and it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person would not have just hurt Linda, they would have other victims too. So Grice had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases that, felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. So in 1982, a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Ulmer was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window, then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had this long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grice finished reading the report, he jumped up and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on Jimmy as he possibly could, and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grice sat at his desk, staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important call, one that would confirm whether Jimmy Ulmer was Linda's killer. After doing a background check on Jimmy, Grice had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex and was literally staying with them when Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy was not alive anymore, but they had gotten in touch with his mother, who gave them her DNA, which they were testing now. So this DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, but it would show if she was at least a relative to the killer. And as Grice waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding, because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally made sense now. Jimmy was this violent serial home invader who had probably seen Linda while staying at his friend's house and maybe stalked her until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes to find more victims. Just then the phone rang, and Grice picked it up, and he could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other side. He was going to get an answer here. But just a second later, they told him it was not a match. Grice's stomach dropped, but he thanked them anyway, and he hung up. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grice kept pushing forward. As the months passed by, he would regularly find new suspects and eventually clear them. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database in case any new additions were, added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grice still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline, and he finally had to make the call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone and dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grice said he did need to retire, and he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into retirement, Grice sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep in an article when his cell phone rang. And when he looked at the ID, he was surprised to see it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He had not gotten a call from them in years, so he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grice was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on the DNA profile that Grice had ordered. And through that process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they did, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints did match the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grice sat up and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. That suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out, the killer had removed that screen from her bedroom window and crept inside, and then they had hid in this closet until she had come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now and finding ways to get close to her and her family, but Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark closet holding their breath as their heart pounded and as they listened to Linda open her bedroom door and walk inside. And the killer continued to wait anxiously as they listened to the sound of Linda getting ready for bed and getting changed, and then eventually they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then after the killer was sure Linda was in bed, the lights are off, it's quiet in the room, they waited even longer just to make sure Linda was asleep and her children were asleep. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they grabbed a coat hanger off the hook in the closet and then burst out of the door. And then before Linda could do anything, make a sound, even react, she's totally caught off guard, the killer was on top of her and had wrapped the coat hanger around her throat. Linda struggled and clawed at her throat to try to get this thing off of her, but the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda, and then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was done, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they'd come in through and wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life and would drive him to and from practice every day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently just developed a total fixation on his mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning out how and when to attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph was interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder, but he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice, and Tim would even very tragically begin to rely on Joseph for, emotional support, grieving the loss of his mother. But it's to her killer. He just didn't know. And then even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row in that picture. In December of 2019, Joseph was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery and was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today we have two stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get new tires for the Like Button's car. But don't tell them you're replacing their regular tires with monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. He really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. That really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th, And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column. But he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. the driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he'd heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So suddenly, with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, I mean, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. I mean, this was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt, and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other, and Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him, and he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was, but he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited, because finally he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull which immediately flooded the ship. And then, making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Before dawn in March of 1997, a police captain was patrolling the outskirts of a small town in North Carolina when up ahead he saw there was this Jeep parked on the shoulder of the highway with its headlights on. Now, the vehicle was suspicious enough that the captain pulled over and he walked up to the Jeep. And as he got closer to it, he heard the engine running and he saw the driver's side window was down, but when he walked around to that side of the car, he saw nobody was inside. However, as he was standing there, a cell phone on the passenger seat began to ring. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you go on vacation with the like button and all your friends, be sure to take lots of pictures. But when you post those pictures on social media, be sure you Photoshop out the like button. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early morning hours of Saturday, March 29, 1997, a blonde 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin carried a tray of filet mignon through a topless bar in Charlotte, North Carolina, while wearing a leotard and tights. She made her way through the cigar smoke-filled room, past the stage where all the half-naked women were busy pole dancing. Kim worked here at the men's club 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she liked the job. It paid well, and by working the night shift, it left her days free, so she could focus on her 2 real passions, which were taking care of her horses and decorating her brand new house. So Kim and her husband Bridger had recently bought a 7-acre plot of land outside the nearby town of Monroe, where Bridger had actually grown up. They'd spent the past year building their dream home, including a barn for their 3 horses, and now that the construction was done, they had finally started moving in and decorating. Now, as Kim delivered the filet mignons to a table of middle-aged businessmen, she glanced over at the clock on the wall, and she felt a surge of excitement when she saw that there was less than an hour left in her shift. Kim had the next 3 days off, and she planned to use all that free time to finish some of the smaller moving projects that still needed to get done, like just unpacking boxes and hanging some pictures. So she flashed the businessmen a smile and then went to check on her other tables. An hour later, a little after 2 a.m., Kim walked out the back entrance of the bar, now wearing a baggy sweatshirt instead of her work uniform, and she called out a goodbye over her shoulder to some coworkers, and then walked over to where her red Jeep was parked along the side of the building. She got in, dropped her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, turned on the car, and then turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. A half an hour later, Kim drove south down Old Charlotte Highway, a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much deserted at this hour. She used to find this commute kind of relaxing, but lately, it had been making her nervous to be driving alone late at night. And the reason for that was because a couple of weeks ago, while she was driving home from work around this same time of night, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another vehicle had come up from behind and started tailgating her and honking their horn at her repeatedly for really no apparent reason. Kim had been afraid that this was a customer from the men's club who was now following her home, and it freaked her out so much that she'd actually pulled over into a convenience store parking lot because she saw there was a police car parked in there as well, and so she'd gone right over to the officer to ask for help. He'd promised to go and try and track down this road rager, and he'd even sent out a broadcast over the police radio, telling all the other officers to keep an eye out for Kim's car on the night she was working in case anyone gave her more trouble. And so now, even though, that road rager had never been caught, Kim did feel better knowing that the police had her back. But again, because the road rager had not been caught, she was still a bit scared about driving home alone. So tonight, to calm her nerves, she fished out her cell phone out of her purse and just called her husband, Bridger. When he answered, he told her that he was actually on the road too. He was still driving back from a gig DJing at a prom in a town 2 hours away, but he was almost home. After chatting for a few minutes, Bridger told Kim that he was actually pulling into their driveway and that he would call her right back once he got inside the house. So Kim said fine and said goodbye, and they hung up, and she kept on driving. Then, about 15 minutes later, so a little before 3 a.m., her phone rang, and it was Bridger again, calling back like he had promised he would. And he asked Kim if she was close, and she told him that she was just passing by Union Station Restaurant, which meant she was maybe about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was pretty tired and he was getting ready for bed, and in case he was asleep by the time she got in, he wished her goodnight. And Kim said goodnight back, and then she hung up, and she put her phone down on the passenger seat. But just as Kim turned her attention back towards the road, a sudden bright light almost blinded her. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights right behind her. About an hour later, Kim's husband Bridger sat up in bed and looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It was 3:59 a.m., an hour after having spoken to Kim. I mean, she should have been home 20 minutes after that phone call, and she still wasn't back. So he got out of bed and he checked every room in their 2-story house, but Kim wasn't in any of them. There was no sign of her. Then Bridger looked out the window and he saw her Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. So at this point, he hurried into the kitchen and he picked up the phone and he dialed Kim's cell phone number. And it rang a few times, and then a strange male voice answered. Bridger asked who he was speaking to, and the man told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger asked him, okay, well, where's my wife? And the officer told him that he didn't know. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the road and found this phone inside of it, and it was ringing, and so he answered it. But he said, there's nobody here. Several minutes later, so this is a little bit after 4 a.m. on March 29, 1997, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, a police investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, drove north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove his patrol car past parking lots and houses until he reached the very edge of town. And finally, he saw what he was looking for: a red Jeep parked along the opposite side of the road, with another patrol car parked right behind it. He pulled a U-turn and parked on the shoulder, and as he got out of his car, he recognized Captain David Simpson standing there, waiting for him. Simpson told Chief Hulk that he had just found this Jeep idling on the side of the road about 15 minutes ago with its headlights on, and he had walked up. There had been nobody inside of it, but when he looked in, there was a cell phone, and it began to ring. And so, acting on instinct, he answered the phone, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin who was calling saying, I'm looking for my wife. This is her phone. She hasn't come home. And Captain Simpson also said that he actually recognized this Jeep from a random run-in he had had 2 weeks earlier outside of a convenience store with Kim Medlin. And so he put it together and he's like, okay, Bridger's calling. This is definitely Kim's car, but Kim's nowhere to be found. And Hulk actually recognized Kim's name because he actually happened to be friends with Kim's husband, Bridger. And so he pulled out his flashlight and he began looking inside the Jeep, and right away, he saw there was a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. And when he looked inside the wallet, there were credit cards, there was cash, but there was like this clear section of the wallet where obviously you would slide your driver's license, and there was nothing there. So it very much looked like her license had been pulled out on purpose. Now, their initial theory was, okay, well, maybe Kim got pulled over by a police officer and took out her license to hand to the cop. But in a department as small as Monroe's, there were only a few officers on duty at this time of night, And when Assistant Chief Hulk asked Captain Simpson, had any of the on-duty officers pulled anybody over that night, Simpson was already all over it. He had checked. And he said, no, none of our officers pulled anybody over. So this made Hulk wonder if maybe Kim had been pulled over by somebody posing as a cop. There had actually been dozens of reports over the years of so-called blue light bandits pretending to be police officers in order to harass drivers, especially young women. But those cases were really quite rare, even though they did happen, so Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions quite yet. Just then, Hulk heard a truck engine and saw headlights approaching up the highway. So he set the wallet back down on the seat and then walked over to where a black pickup truck was now pulling to a stop right behind Hulk's car. A tall man with blonde hair got out of the driver's seat, and right away Hulk knew who it was. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. And Bridger looked frantic, and he demanded to know what had happened to his wife. But Hulk told him to calm down, that they were here to try to figure out what happened to his wife and where she went. Hulk went on to say that, look, we showed up and we just found her car here. But there were no broken windows or slashed tires or any sign of a struggle, so it was possible that maybe Kim just ran into car trouble and maybe she went out to go find help. But then, without asking for permission, Bridger pushed past Hulk and just climbed right inside of the Jeep's driver's seat and said, well, let's test your theory right now and see whether the car was working. Hulk told him to get out of the Jeep, but Bridger just totally ignored him, and then he put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse and he drove it backward, ultimately parking it in its original place, showing that it worked just fine. And even though at this point Hulk was kind of annoyed with Bridger for what he had just done, he couldn't help but think, this is bad, something's going on here. And so Hulk walked over to his car and he radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. And he asked them to bring a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she left on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, and a few officers and a police dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog went in and sniffed around, getting familiar with the scent of Kim's belongings. Then the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground, and so the officers told Bridger, who clearly wanted to go with them, to stay put, stay with your truck, and then they followed the dog down the road for about 100 yards or so until it turned onto a driveway. Hulk and the others followed the dog up this long driveway towards a small house nestled in the trees right off the highway, and the dog sniffed all the way up to the garage and then stopped. That was where Kim's trail ended. And so Hulk went up to the house and rang the doorbell, and a minute later, a man answered. And despite the late hour, he looked totally awake and not particularly surprised to see cops at his door. Hulk asked the man who he was and whether or not he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours near his property. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett, and about an hour ago, so maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he noticed that it had Texas plates, and that there also had been a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan told them to go right ahead. And so Hulk directed the other officers to search the inside of the house, while he clicked on his flashlight and headed over to the garage. When he got there, he turned the handle of a door on the side of the garage, and he found it was unlocked. So he pushed the door open, and he shined his flashlight inside, but all he saw was a truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time dawn broke around 6 a.m. that morning, this had become officially a missing persons case. So police began a search of the woods around the Old Charlotte Highway with help from members of the community. Meanwhile, Hulk and Simpson went back to the station to speak to one of the dispatchers who had been on duty that night. After speaking to that homeowner, Nathan, and searching his house and his garage, he had been ruled out as a suspect. So now they were focused on finding that car with the Texas plates that Nathan had seen loitering outside of his garage. So they were hoping that maybe there was a report of a traffic stop or maybe a suspicious car in the area or anything that might help figure out who was driving that car. But the dispatcher said again that really there had been no stops, nothing that night. However, there had been one incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., so it was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They'd gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was found. Hulk asked who had responded to that call, and the dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately gave Officer Griffin a phone call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out responding to that car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He actually said that his shift was over around the time that driver had flagged him down for help, so he had actually just called for a tow truck, and when it got there, maybe a little bit after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he just went home. Hulk hung up the phone feeling pretty disappointed. Bridger said the last time he heard from his wife Kim was around 3 a.m., so if this car was already being towed away by 2:30 a.m., then it definitely was not the same car that Nathan saw loitering outside of his garage, and the driver of that car in the ditch was likely not a suspect. Hulk sighed in frustration, but then another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to elaborate on that random run-in he had had with Kim a couple of weeks earlier. Now, this was sort of a long shot to bring it up again, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from the road rage incident could have maybe come back and, maybe chased Kim off the road or something. Simpson said he would go dig up the report that he had filed on the incident, and then he left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the road rage police report. It said that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, so exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer named Roger Griffin. So Officer Josh Griffin is the one who responded to the car stuck in the ditch. Officer Roger Griffin is actually Josh's father, and he was with Captain Simpson that night. So the report said that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually caught up with the car that was harassing Kim a little bit further down the road. There were two men inside the car, Eric Williams and George Connell, and they claimed that they thought Kim was actually the one harassing them by flashing her lights at them. And so to Simpson and to Griffin, it had seemed like a big misunderstanding, so the officers had just let them go. But Hulk, now looking at this through a very different lens, felt like he needed to speak to Eric and George regardless. And so in the report, he found the contact information for Eric and George, and he called them both up. But it turned out they both had airtight alibis for the night of Kim's disappearance. But even still, it struck Hulk as very odd that Kim had gone missing from her car on the same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. And he had a hard time believing it was all just, one big coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk drove down Westwood Industrial Drive, a deserted dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep was found. And as he was driving, he saw at the end of the street there were a couple of police cars parked there. And so he pulled his own car behind them, and he got out. He walked into the trees where he could see the beams of several flashlights moving around in the darkness. And as he got closer, he saw officers putting up police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a pile of roofing shingles and branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from two men who were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they said to police that they had found a body in the woods in this spot, but they hadn't touched it. And so now with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team removed the shingles and branches that were covering the body, and Hulk pulled out his flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. And he saw right away it was a deceased woman, and it was definitely Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten, and there were also cuts and bruises all over her neck, and there were some scrapes on her knees. And her necklace and wedding ring were still on, so her killer had not robbed her. Hulk stood back as the forensics team untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could collect clippings of her fingernails, in case she had maybe scratched off a trace of her killer's DNA. And as Hulk watched one of these forensics officers go to put the sweatshirt inside of an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and he shined his flashlight on the sweatshirt's fabric, and it revealed a shoe print. And so he told the officers to send that sweatshirt to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and type of shoe that had left that print. But while he would have to wait for those results, he knew he had a couple of other big clues to help narrow down a suspect. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known as Lover's Lane, so basically a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. And the fact that Kim's killer had thought to take her there meant they were probably a local and familiar with the area. Now, it was still theoretically possible that she'd just been run off the road by some stranger for some reason, or, maybe a customer had followed her home from work, or maybe it was a blue light bandit impersonating a police officer. But the second big clue was that there was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. And because of that, Hulk did not think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room with his friend and first murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger had been really pushy and really in some ways over-involved in the investigation from literally the moment Kim's Jeep was found. He'd messed with the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission, and now Hulk had information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. So when Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, he called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then he immediately went to bed. But now, a police officer had told Hulk that he had seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house, and nowhere near the route he would have taken to get back from his DJing gig. So once Hulk sat down, immediately he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. I mean, he's just learned that his wife was found dead, but Hulk had a job to do. And so he cut right to the chase. And he said to Bridger that, hey, this other officer said they saw your truck driving around in town. It contradicts your alibi. Why did you lie? And right away, Bridger exploded. He was so mad. And he shouted at Hulk that he couldn't believe at a time like this, you would accuse me of lying to you? You're insinuating that I hurt my wife? I didn't do this. He also yelled at Hulk for just wasting time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many clues pointing to a different story, like the lack of a struggle at the Jeep and the rolled down window and missing driver's license, all of which made it look like a traffic stop gone wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anybody, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially after that road rage incident 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She never would have done that. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down security footage from around town on the night Kim was killed to see if there was proof that really Bridger was driving around when he said he was home. Because right now they had no evidence to show he was lying, and they actually just had to let Bridger go. But when Bridger was leaving, he'd been so angry and so defensive, it sort of made Hulk think that maybe Bridger did this. And in fact, the fact that Bridger had brought up that his wife would never have gotten out of the car in the middle of the night for a stranger, well, that only reinforced that she might have gotten out of the car for you, Bridger, because she knew and trusted you. But also, Hulk was thinking that another person or group of people that Kim might have gotten out of the car for would be police. Now, Hulk already knew that there were no police that pulled anybody over that night, but somebody could have pretended to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That was a theory that did sort of make sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep at certain times of the night because of that road rage incident. Now, police radios were not private, so anybody with a police scanner could have been listening in, and what they would have heard is, well, around this time of the night, this woman, Kim, often drives this road all by herself. And they basically could have just been waiting for her, knowing she was vulnerable. So Hulk picked up his phone and he began calling around to other police departments in the region. And he actually found out there had been 2 separate reports of blue light bandits harassing women recently. Now, one of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail when Kim was killed, so it could not have been him. But the other suspect still hadn't been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed down the phone in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the leads he'd had at the start of the investigation were now coming back as dead ends. When he tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance, there was no sign of her husband Bridger's truck driving through town until 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had been found by police. So the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck driving around at 2:30 did appear to have been mistaken, as Bridger said. Hulk also had reached out to Kim's manager and co-workers at the bar she worked at, thinking maybe her killer might have been a patron who followed her home. But none of them knew of any problems she had had with customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business that was near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night that Kim disappeared, and as he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he had seen her red Jeep go past. And right afterwards, he saw another car that was going in the other direction make a sort of sudden, sharp three-point turn and speed right after the Jeep. The man had said that this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the rear, and he thought, or at least assumed, it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew that every single Monroe police officer that was on duty that night was accounted for, and they hadn't pulled anybody over at the time that Kim went missing. However, this new information certainly did support the theory that maybe Kim's killer was posing as a police officer, that they were a blue light bandit. So, Hulk had spent the past couple of days trying to track down witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught. But he kept coming up dry. Nobody knew anything that could help track down that suspect. So it seemed like the investigation was really starting to slow down. But then Hulk's phone rang, and he answered it, and it was an expert from the forensics lab who had just finished analyzing that shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. And so Hulk leaned forward in nervous anticipation as the expert told him the results. And when he did, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on March 29, 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They'd been prowling around for hours, pulling over young women for minor traffic infractions or sometimes for doing nothing wrong at all. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep coming down this road several nights a week, and they'd sort of grown obsessed with the young blonde woman who was driving it. And now they decided it was finally time to do something about that. So they pulled an abrupt three-point turn and raced after the Jeep and flipped on their car's flashing lights. Pretty soon, the Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder, and the killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside naturally rolled down the window, and she handed over her driver's license, which said her name was Kim Medlin. And then she politely asked what the problem was, and the killer just told her to get out of the car. Now, Kim was visibly confused, but she did as she was told. And once she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists and then dragged her over to their car and tossed her in the back seat. Then the killer got in the driver's seat of their car as Kim began crying and insisting that she didn't do anything wrong. Why was she being arrested? But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing as they realized that even though they'd been dreaming about this moment for weeks, they actually didn't really have a plan for what they would do next. And so after a moment, they pulled over and just idled for a minute while they figured out what their next move was going to be. And then an idea came to them. They put their car in drive and continued down the highway. And as they turned onto a secluded dead-end road, Kim in the back seat suddenly got very quiet. And so the killer picked up on that and looked in the rearview mirror and saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And the killer suddenly realized that in all their excitement, they'd forgotten to lock the rear doors. The killer immediately tried to lock their doors with the power locks, but before they could, the rear door opened and Kim jumped out of the moving car. And so the killer came to a hard stop, they leapt out of the car, and they ran back for Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands are still cuffed behind her, and without even thinking, the killer lifted up their flashlight, and they smashed it into Kim's head, and then they stomped on her back and broke her neck. But the killer wasn't done. they reached down and they put their flashlight around Kim's neck, basically put it up against her throat, and then they pulled back on their arms, basically creating sort of a noose around her neck with this flashlight. And they held it like that, and they pulled as tight as they could until Kim stopped moving. After that, they dragged her body off the road and into the woods, where they removed her handcuffs and covered her body with branches and debris to hide it. Then the killer went home and cleaned up their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had actually left behind one crucial piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on the tread, which made it very easy to identify. And so weeks later, the forensics lab traced that print back to a shoe that was made by the Thorogood Company, a supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model happened to be the exact same shoe issued to officers in the Monroe Public Safety Department, which meant Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who had responded to a car in a ditch about a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would turn out Josh had learned the details about Kim's vehicle and late-night driving patterns from his father, Officer Roger Griffin, after his father told him about that road rage incident that he and Captain Simpson had responded to on March 15th. And so Josh had basically been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since. Josh Griffin was arrested on May 30th, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the best we can offer is he became obsessed with Kim and attacked her. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to learn about 3 places you shouldn't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button that you love their new haircut, but secretly have your fingers crossed behind your back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On July 11th, 1999, 17-year-old Thomas Nazaro was taking part in a month-long mountaineering course in Alaska. He, along with 10 other students and 3 instructors, had spent the past 26 days hiking up several peaks, and now they were taking a break at the base of this glacier. They were going to hike up the glacier, but before they did, it was customary to reward the students that had done the best job over the previous few weeks, taking on all the different mountaineering skills and survival skills, and allowing those students to hike on their own up this glacier for the last couple of days. And so the instructors hand chose a couple of students that fell into that category. Thomas was one of them, and told them after this break was over, they could head up and they would see them at the end of the trip. And so feeling very proud, Thomas and the other students who had been chosen stood up and began walking up this glacier. And after a couple of hours, they'd made it about 3 miles up when they found this perfectly flat area that was perfect for camping out. And so they decided that that would be their campsite for the night. And so everybody started setting up their own tent and getting their sleeping bag laid out, and Thomas volunteered to go find some water. He had heard what sounded like a stream a little ways away from where their campsite was, and so Thomas grabbed his pot and he went around the corner out of sight. After a while, when all the other students had set up their campsites, they realized Thomas had not come back yet. And so they walked around this corner and they looked and they realized it was a dead end. About 100 feet in front of them is just a huge ice wall that goes up on all 3 sides, and there's nowhere else to go, but Thomas is not up there and he did not come back to the campsite. And so they're thinking, that's pretty weird. I mean, is he behind some ice crevasse that we can't see? And so as they're looking from a distance, they see that his water pot is sitting at the base of this ice cliff. And so they figure, okay, he's somewhere over there, obviously. And so they start walking up towards the base of the ice cliff, still yelling his name, and he's not yelling back. And they get about 3/4 of the way to this ice wall when one of the other students yells, "Stop!" And they all stop and look down where he's looking, and they all realize what's happened to Thomas. They turn around because it's extremely dangerous where they're walking, and they run back through their camp, down the trail, and they find their instructors and they tell them what they think happened to Thomas. Their instructors are horrified. They run up the trail. They make it just before the base of this ice wall. They get as close as they can, knowing that it's very dangerous what they're trying to do, and they realize there's nothing they can do to help Thomas. And so before long, the police are called, and it's a full-scale rescue operation on top of this glacier. The theory of what happened to Thomas is he left his campsite with his pot of water. He went around the corner, so he's out of sight, and he went to the stream, the glacier stream, and he started filling up his water, but it was taking a long time because the stream just was not very powerful. And from where he was, he would have heard the sound of rushing water coming from the ice wall because there was water pouring down the ice wall. And so he would have walked over to the base of this ice cliff and put his jug out to get water, and as soon as he was right up against it, he would have slipped down into the ice. Because at the base of this ice wall was something called a moulin, which is a hole in the glacier caused by water runoff percolating down through a crack. And over the years, they can get pretty deep. And so when the police showed up, they went over to the hole and they're yelling down to Thomas, but they're not getting a response. So one of the skinnier officers put on a dry suit and then a harness and then was lowered head first into this hole. And so the inside of a moulin, it starts wide, but then it gets smaller and tighter all the way down until it comes to a point. But sometimes that point is very far down into the ice. And so this officer was hoping that at least, even if he couldn't get to Thomas, he could at least see Thomas. But after going 100 feet down, the hole got so narrow he couldn't go any farther, and even with his light, the hole just kept going. It was like into infinity all the way down into this glacier, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so after that officer was pulled out of the hole, the police went to a fiber optic cable that had a camera at the end of it, and they began lowering that down into this hole. And so down it went, deeper and deeper. It passed the 100-foot mark and all the way down until they literally ran out of cable. And so from this camera's perspective, 250 feet down into this glacier, the hole just kept on going and going and going, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so they pulled the cable out and they realized there was nothing they could do for Thomas. Since he was below 250 feet, that means he fell at least 250 feet. And so it's unlikely he survived the fall to wherever it eventually stopped. And if he did somehow survive the fall, which is a horrifying thought in some ways, he would have been wedged somewhere deep down inside of this glacier, and the water runoff coming off of the ice wall would have eventually filled up all around him and gone over his head, and he would have drowned. And so shortly after the search was started, they called it off. There really was nothing they could do. And unfortunately, his body was never recovered. In 1998, Fresha Bakery, which was a bread company in Leicester, England, was all about profits. And their employees knew this because all the time corners were being cut for the sake of money, even if it was totally dangerous. In May of that year, one of the company's industrial ovens needed a minor repair. One of the cogs inside the oven had come loose and fallen off, and someone just needed to pick it up and put it back on. To picture this oven in your head, think of the scanner you put your luggage through at the airport, the X-ray machine. It's kind of like that. It was this 80-foot long metal tunnel where there was a conveyor belt that ran through it, and you would put dough on one side and it would run through with the conveyor belt through this oven, and then on the other side it would be fully cooked. Whenever repairs were needed inside one of these ovens, the procedure was to completely turn off the oven. So not just the heat, but the whole operation needed to be completely shut down, and then the oven would sit for almost a full 24 hours before a mechanic would go in and make the repair. But the mechanic cost money, and every hour that this bread machine was not operational, the company would lose $1,500. And so the managers of this company thought, you know what, that's too much money to be giving up. If we do the repairs ourselves, that saves us on the cost of the mechanic, and if we can find a way to make the repairs while leaving the oven partially running, that will save us a whole bunch of money too. Someone pointed out that it was possible to turn the heat all the way down in the oven, but allow the conveyor belt to keep rotating through. They just needed to find a way to get in with this conveyor belt moving around them. And so they came up with a plan. Even though the oven sat flush to the ground, there was a side panel that could open up and you could crawl underneath the oven, and right above you would be the conveyor belt. And so they thought, well, hey, if we just remove a couple of sections of the conveyor belt, when that gap in the belt cycles around and is right over someone who is standing underneath it, they can stand up into that gap and kind of be hunched over and walk along inside of the oven, staying in that gap until they come across the cog that's going to be right on the ground. They can pick it up, put it right back on, and keep walking on, staying in the gap until they reach the other side, at which point they could crawl out the exit. The managers were confident, and so they began walking around the factory asking for volunteers, and they were offering offering extra pay. Two men, 44-year-old Ian Erickson and 47-year-old David Mays, volunteered for the job, and their managers told them they would do it the next day because they needed time to turn the heat off on the oven and let it cool down first. That night, David was out with his friends and he was talking about how he was kind of nervous about getting inside of a semi-operational industrial oven, but he told them the money was good. The following day at 9 a.m., the oven's heat was turned all the way down, and the plan was it would sit like that all day and cool off all day, and then in the evening, Ian and David would get inside and do the job. But Ian and David had a really important soccer game they wanted to watch that night, and so they asked their manager, would it be possible to go in a little bit earlier? And so the manager walked down to the oven and put his hand inside one of the entrances, and there were fans blowing into it, and it had been off for a couple of hours, and he thought, you know what, this is probably fine, you guys can go now. A few sections of the conveyor belt were removed, Ian was given a radio, and the two men opened the side to the oven, and they crawled in on the far left side of the oven, and they waited for the gap to come around. When it did, they popped up, and they began their journey into the center of the oven. About 5 minutes later, Ian came over the radio and said, hey, it's really hot in here. And the manager came back and said, don't worry, it's supposed to be a little warm in there, but it's nothing that can hurt you. And then a couple of seconds later, Ian comes back over the radio and says, no, it's really hot in here. It is unbearably hot in here. And so one of the managers ran over and checked the temperature gauge, which unbelievably no one had done to that point. And the temperature at the center of the oven was reading over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to boil water in the center of this oven. And unfortunately, there was nowhere for Ian or David to go. The belt could not go in reverse, and the fastest it could move is 17 minutes start to finish, so agonizingly slow. And they could not crawl up or below the conveyor belt in either direction. There wasn't enough clearance, and they'd get sucked up into the machinery. So they literally had to stay in the gap and slowly walk towards the hottest section of the oven. And so for 10 minutes, Ian and David slowly made their way across this oven, screaming out in pain, yelling for help from anyone, someone, but no one could do anything. And even if they hit the emergency stop button on the oven, it wouldn't help them because the heat inside of the oven is not because it's on, it was residual heat. And by turning off the oven, that would just stop the conveyor belt, trapping Ian and David in the hottest part of the oven. Workers ran and got their tools and did everything they could to try to dismantle portions of the oven to try to get down to Ian and David. But by the time they finally pulled off big pieces of the oven, Ian had already made it to the other side and been pulled out, and he was unfortunately deceased. He had been burned alive, and David had collapsed somewhere in the oven and had been crushed by the machinery that went over him. The bakery and their management team were all fined for their part in this tragedy. Something most people don't know is you can't just put scuba tanks on and then dive down to any depth and come right back up again. The compressed air inside of those scuba tanks would be a mixture of oxygen as well as most likely helium and nitrogen. And when you're breathing that compressed air, the oxygen would get breathed up and then not linger inside of your body. But the other inert gases, the helium and the nitrogen, they would be breathed up and then absorbed into your bloodstream, and they would stay there until you resurfaced. Now, it's completely harmless as long as you understand how it works getting those gases out of your body. In a nutshell, as you ascend, these inert gases will leave your body on their own, but it's a gradual process. If you rocket to the surface before this takes place, these inert gases will not leave your body and they'll expand inside of you, and your body will become the equivalent of a shaken up soda can. And so at best, having all these bubbles inside of you is very painful. At worst, it's lethal. The term for this condition is decompression sickness, but it's better known as the bends. The way divers protect themselves from getting the bends is on their ascent, they do what's called a decompression stop. This is something that is planned into the dive where they stop at a certain depth for a certain amount of time, and that guarantees the inert gases have diffused out of their body before they reach the surface. Now, the deeper you go, the more decompression stops you'll have to do, and the longer they will take. For example, ascending from 2,000 feet would take over 33 hours to do safely. But luckily, none of us are trying to dive down to 2,000 feet. Well, unless you're trying to be an oil and gas saturation diver. Saturation divers, or SAT divers, do construction and demolition at depths of up to 2,000 feet below the surface. But they don't spend 33 hours ascending after every single dive. Instead, after their dives, they're artificially kept at their working depth. The way this works is the SAT diver climbs inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship or on board an oil rig, and this chamber also doubles as their living quarters. There's beds, beds and there's a bathroom, but it's laughably small and uncomfortable. It looks like a small submarine. And once they go inside, they seal the door and then they pressurize it to match the depth that they're going to be working at the bottom of the ocean. And then also there's another pressure chamber called the dive bell that's connected directly onto the side of the chamber. And that's also pressurized to match the working depth. When it was time for the sat diver to go to work, they would put their dive gear on inside of the chamber. They would crawl directly into the dive bell. They would shut the door behind them and seal it. And then people outside of the dive bell would physically disconnect it from the chamber. And then using a crane, they would place it in the water and then lower it down to their working depth. And once they get down there, because the pressure inside the bell is equal to the pressure outside the bell, they can just slide open a door on the bottom and the water does not come inside. And so the divers do slip through this hole and they do the work they need to do. And when they're done, they come back inside the dive bell, they shut it up, and then using the radio, they communicate with the people up on the boat or up on the rig, and they raise the bell back up, they reattach them to the chamber, they go inside, they take their stuff off, there's bunk beds and there's a bathroom inside of the chamber, and that's where they hang out until their next dive. This process is repeated for days and days and days, keeping them saturated with these gases. And then at the end of their shift, which is usually about a month long, they will have one long decompression they do inside of the chamber. While this system is highly efficient, it does not change the fact that saturation diving is extremely dangerous and terrifying. The sun doesn't reach below 700 feet, so most of the time these divers are in complete and total darkness, and it's unbelievably cold down there. And so their suits have hot water pumped into them through a tether that's connected to the dive bell. But if that were to fail, hypothermia would kick in almost immediately. They have flashlights, but the water is so full of sediment around the areas that they work that shining the light is basically like shining it into fog. You can't really see very far besides right in front of your face. Sat divers also report that sometimes the water around them will suddenly move violently and they'll look around, but their crummy light and lack of visibility means they can't see what it was, but they know it's a large animal that's checking them out. Other times, these fairly large fish will swim right up to them and come right under their light. It's almost like they're being affectionate with the diver. But they're not being affectionate. They're trying to hide behind the sat diver from some large predator that's out there watching them. Experienced sat divers have learned to just accept their harsh environment down there and don't easily get scared. But there is one thing that all sat divers are afraid of, and that is a lost bell. When sat divers are down at their working depth, the dive bell that's brought them down there is usually situated right next to them, just kind of floating in the water. And this dive bell is connected to the ship or the oil rig above by a cable. And if that cable were to snap, the dive bell would fall to the bottom and it would take with it the divers because they're always tethered to the dive bell. If the divers survived the crash to the ocean floor, they would then just be trapped and have to hope that someone comes down to get them at some point before they run out of air or they succumb to hypothermia. While a lost bell scenario is incredibly rare, it has happened before. On August 7th, 1979, Richard Walker was inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship in the North Sea. He was a saturation diver who for the past 10 days had been in saturation and honestly was just over it. He wanted to go home to his wife and his 15-month-old daughter. That evening, before his scheduled dive, he wrote in his journal, "Dear God, I just want to get out." Soon after writing this entry, he and his partner, Victor Giel, put on their dive gear and hopped into the dive bell. The bell was detached from the chamber and then brought over to the side of the ship, and right before they lowered it into the water, somebody noticed the location transponder that basically beamed up where it was down below had become loose, and so the decision was made to just remove it. And so after they pulled it off, they lowered the dive bell onto the water and then slowly lowered it down to their working depth, which was 485 feet. Once they got down there, they opened up the hole at the bottom of the bell, and then they began taking turns exiting the bell to go work on this underwater structure. A few hours later, at 2:45 in the morning, Richard was the one outside of the dive bell, and he heard something behind him, and he turned around and he saw the dive bell had slightly tilted on its side. Right as he noticed this, the radio in his helmet kicked on and told him he needed to go back inside the dive bell immediately, and they were going to try to pull them back up. And so Richard went inside the bell, he closed the hole behind him, and then he and Victor listened to the radio as they told them that the main cable holding the dive bell had slipped out. Now, this main cable was not the only thing connecting the dive bell up to the ship. There was also another clump of wires and tubes that was called the umbilical that ran all their power and hot water and their comms down to the dive bell. But this umbilical was not meant to be load-bearing. But as it stood with this main cable gone, the umbilical was holding the dive bell from slipping to the bottom of the ocean. And so the crew up on the ship decided their only choice was to use the umbilical to reel this dive bell back in. And so they began pulling them up by the umbilical, and almost immediately it completely snapped, and the dive bell fell to the bottom of the ocean about 50 feet below. Now, normally a dive bell would have what's called a clump weight hanging off the bottom of it. And in an emergency, you could detach this clump weight, and the dive bell is buoyant enough it would go up to the surface. But Richard and Victor's company had cut corners and not used a clump weight, and instead attached weights directly to the dive bell, which meant when they hit the ocean floor, the actual dive bell was sitting on the ocean floor, where that hole they would normally escape from was pressed into the seabed, so they could not get out of their dive bell. Whereas if there had been a clump weight, the clump weight would have hit the ground and the dive bell would have hovered slightly over it. And so worst case scenario, they could have gotten out and done a wet transfer into another dive bell. So with the umbilical cut, they had no radio communication, they had no heat, they had no light, and they had very little remaining oxygen. And so all they could do was just sit in darkness and hope somebody rescues them. Less than 30 minutes later, another dive ship arrived and offered to help. Now, they were not expecting to dive that night, so it took about 3 hours before they actually had their rescue divers in the water. And unfortunately, because the location transponder had been removed from the dive bell before Richard and Victor went under, it made it almost impossible for these rescue divers to find it. But after an hour of looking around, they finally found it. It was 7 a.m. and they went right down to the porthole and they shined a light inside of the dive bell. And inside, Richard and Victor are given a thumbs up like, hey, we're okay. We're just ready to get rescued. The fact that Richard and Victor were okay was communicated back up to the surface, and everybody on top was so excited, so relieved. And in fact, they called Richard's wife and they told her that, hey, there's been an accident, but your husband's just fine. He'll be out very soon. But despite these rescue divers locating the dive bell, because the ship up above that they were attached to kept moving around, it was proving to be extremely difficult for them to stay over the dive bell. And so for the next 2 hours, these rescue divers desperately tried to thread a new wire through the top of the dive bell, but it was going so poorly, and they kept going around and shining their light into the porthole to check on Richard and Victor. And it was very clear that their situation was getting worse and worse by the second. They were not giving thumbs up and smiling. They looked panicked and desperate, and they'd been without heat now for hours, and it was obvious they were running out of oxygen. Finally, at 9 a.m., so 6 hours after Richard and Victor had first hit the sea floor, the rescue divers managed to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell. And before they signaled to have it brought back up again, they shined a light through the porthole to check on them one more time, and they saw that Richard and Victor were just sitting there with their head in their hands. They were clearly still alive and lucid, but it was like they understood they have very little time left, and if this doesn't work, they're doomed. At this point, the rescue divers called up and said it was ready. They got pulled up to the surface, and then the ship began pulling up the dive bell, and almost immediately the cable snapped. And everybody up on the surface knew that at this point, it was almost impossible for them to survive. But nonetheless, rescue divers went down, and it took a while to find the dive bell because it had moved. But when they did, they shined the light through the porthole, and Richard and Victor were still very much alive, but they were not looking to interact with the divers at the window anymore. They were just sitting there looking down. They were despondent. It was like they were making peace with what they understood was going to happen. They were not going to get out of there. And over the course of the next several hours, as these rescue divers tried desperately to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell, they kept checking on Richard and Victor, and each time they checked, they would slouch lower and lower in their seats until both of them were laying on their side. And then finally, the rescue divers got a cable through the top, and then afterwards, they went back up to the ship, and then the ship was able this time to pull the dive bell up and back on board. But when they opened the door, both Richard and Victor had passed away. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button that you really like their new haircut, but secretly have your fingers crossed behind your back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 videos. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the photo that is famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please dress the like button in a realistic bear suit, and then send them to the next Omante ritual in Japan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2016, 21-year-old Darren Mitchell was living in Southeast Texas in a town called Navasota. He was serving in the U.S. National Guard, he was the proud father of a 1-year-old little girl, and he was engaged to the little girl's mother. Anyone that knew Darren knew his main goal in life was to support his little beloved family. While he personally really wanted to go to a trade school, he ended up putting his dream on hold to raise money so his fiancée could go to nursing school. And their plan was after she completed nursing school, Darren would then raise more money and go to school himself. That spring, Southeast Texas was hit with record rainfalls. It seemed like for Darren, every time he went to and from work, the sky was always gray and the road was always wet. But of all the thunderstorms that passed through that area that year, there was none more powerful than the 24-hour thunderstorm that began on May 26th. That afternoon, Darren was on his way home from work. He was traveling along Texas State Highway 105. It was raining so hard that his windshield wipers literally could not keep up with the amount of water hitting his windshield. And so he eventually just had to slow way down just to make sure he didn't crash into anyone. He looked around him and the fields and the ditches next to the road were already filling with water because the ground was already completely saturated from all the rainfall over the past couple of months. Before long, Darren found himself stopping right in the middle of the highway behind this huge row of traffic. Apparently there was some significant flooding up ahead on the road and people were hesitant to drive through it. And so after a while, when this huge row of traffic was just not moving and the rain was just continuing to pour down, Darren started to worry he might be in an emergency situation, that this could be a flash flood scenario. And so he called his brother and he told him that he was stuck on Highway 105 because there was flooding up ahead, there was flooding behind him, he couldn't really go anywhere. And so his brother asked him, what are you going to do? And at some point Darren said, hey, I can actually get out my window, so I'm fine, I'll talk to you later. But after that, nobody heard from Darren. And later that afternoon, when Darren didn't make it home, his family got really concerned and they called the police. And so that night, a search was launched to find Darren, but there was no sign of him. But the next morning, they did discover Darren's blue pickup truck. It had flipped over. It was off the side of the highway near a river that had been created by the floodwaters. Darren was not inside of the vehicle, but 24 hours later, they did discover his body. He had drowned and he had drifted 1 mile downstream of his truck. The family was obviously devastated by this horrible loss, but they just could not reconcile how he had been on the phone with his brother saying that he was going to be just fine to just a couple days later being found dead. And it would turn out there was actually a witness that watched what happened to Darren. She had been caught up in this flash flood as well, except she was in a vehicle that did not get swept away. And so she was watching Darren as the floodwaters raged around his vehicle, and she said he climbed out of the window and he got into the bed of his pickup truck, and then from the bed he moved up to the roof of his truck, and at this point the waters began pulling his vehicle, and so his vehicle became unsteady, and from her perspective it seemed like Darren did not like his odds on the roof of his truck, and so he climbed back inside of his truck. And then just a couple of minutes later, his vehicle was dragged into a deeper section of the water and it flipped upside down and was pulled under, and Darren did not reemerge. With this information, Darren's family was able to figure out that when Darren climbed back into his truck right before it flipped over, he posted something to Facebook that now, looking back at it, is unbelievably haunting. Randy Weaver was a college dropout and a former Army Green Beret, which is the Army Special Forces. He and his wife Vicky were religious fundamentalists and deeply distrusted the government and believed the end of the world was imminent. In the early 1980s, they began hoarding guns and began making plans to live in some secluded area off the grid. In 1984, Randy, Vicky, and their children moved into a cabin they had built themselves overlooking Ruby Creek in Idaho. By choice, they had no electricity and no water. After receiving information that Randy had made threats against the President Ronald Reagan and other government officials, the FBI and the Secret Service began investigating him. Although no charges were ever filed against him, in their investigation, they discovered he had ties to the Aryan Nation, which is a white supremacist group. So in 1989, when Randy inadvertently sold 2 illegal weapons to undercover ATF agents, they said, instead of arresting you and sending you to jail, you can actually become an informant on the Aryan Nation. But Randy said he wasn't tied to the Aryan Nation and couldn't do that, and so they indicted him for making and keeping illegal weapons. After being released on bail in 1991, Randy missed his court date, and so a warrant was issued for his arrest. The U.S. Marshal Service was now responsible for bringing Randy in, but given his significant weapon arsenal and his anti-government stance, they assumed he would not go easily. And so they decided they would launch a secret surveillance campaign of Randy, his family, and where they lived to gain some intelligence on what they did day to day and find the right time to go up and apprehend him. So in early 1992, secret surveillance teams were set up all around the Weaver family cabin, and what they found was the Weaver family, despite being extremist, they mostly kept to themselves, and they definitely were not aware they were being watched. The only reason the marshals didn't just go up and apprehend him was because anytime the Weavers were outside of their cabin, they were always armed. A few months later, in August, as the surveillance teams were getting ready to set up for the day to gather more intelligence on the Weavers, the Weaver dogs took notice of the surveillance teams and started charging into the woods barking like maniacs. And Randy, along with his friend Kevin Harris that was staying with them, and Randy's teenage son Sammy, took off after the dogs, not knowing that they were going to be running straight into a government surveillance team. And when these two parties encountered each other, a firefight ensued that left Sammy, Randy's son, dead, along with their dog dead, and one of the marshals, William Deegan, was killed as well. Who shot first and who shot whom would later be hotly debated by all the survivors in the courts and in the media. Immediately after the shooting stopped, Randy and Kevin turned around and ran back up to the cabin to take cover. Meanwhile, the surviving marshals ran out of the forest and they told their boss what had happened, and their boss is like, this is going to turn into a standoff, we need this to end right now. And so he called the FBI and he painted a picture of the Weaver family and Randy specifically as this enormous threat, that it had been this unprovoked attack on the marshals and that they got to come in force to put an end to this thing. And so the next day, hundreds of FBI agents, huge vehicles and helicopters, they all showed up in this little area in Idaho getting ready to do battle with the Weaver family. Because the FBI had been told the Weaver family was this huge threat, they authorized all of their snipers to shoot any armed adult without warning them. Normally, the FBI, if they see someone who's armed, they would yell at them to stop what they were doing, put their weapon down, warn them. Unless, of course, this person is actively shooting at them, then of course the FBI is going to shoot back. But if it's just an armed person standing there, the FBI can't just engage them. But in this situation, the FBI said, this threat is so big, we're changing the rules. And so you had all these FBI snipers all around the Weaver property that are all amped up, they're getting ready to engage the enemy, they're off safe, finger on trigger, slack out, ready to engage the first adult they see. And so it stayed like this for quite a while, a total stalemate, until Randy, Kevin Harris, and Randy's teenage daughter Sarah decided to leave their cabin and go down to Sammy to pay their respects. But Randy and Kevin were carrying weapons, and so after they left the cabin, they walked a little ways away, and then snipers opened up on them. In that initial volley of fire, only Randy got hit in the shoulder, and so Randy, Kevin, and Sarah, they turn, they start running back towards the cabin to take cover, and standing in the doorway of the cabin, inside the cabin, is Vicky, Randy's wife, and she's standing there holding their 10-month-old daughter, and so Randy makes it inside, Sarah makes it in the front door, Kevin is the last one to go through the door, and right as he's going through the doorway, the sniper had his sights set on Kevin, and he fired, he missed Kevin, the round went through the door, and it hit Vicky squarely in the head, and it killed her instantly. Adding insult to injury, the FBI did not know they had just killed their mother, and so after the shooting stopped and the door had shut and the Weavers are back inside the cabin, the FBI began calling out to them saying, Mrs. Weaver, come out, don't you want to protect your kids? Come out and we'll get you guys pancakes and you can sit with your kids, you gotta get them out of there. But Vicky was dead, they just didn't know. Ultimately, the FBI went out and got a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran who had similar views to Randy, and they sent him in to try to convince Randy to stop this and surrender, and eventually he got Randy to do that, so no more blood was shed. Later, an investigation would show law enforcement that was handling this case made a number of really critical mistakes early on. The first big mistake being the miscommunication between the marshals to the FBI about how big of a threat the Weaver family really posed. Now, they certainly were a threat, but they were not such a big threat that they required hundreds of FBI agents and helicopters and armored vehicles. The second critical mistake was when the FBI authorized their snipers to shoot at armed adults without a warning. That's almost certainly why Vicky was killed. In the end, despite having a plethora of charges against him, jurors decided that Randy Weaver was only guilty of not showing up to that court date. Amid intense federal scrutiny of the Ruby Ridge scandal, the FBI's number 2 person was demoted, 3 other agents were suspended, and 1 was sent to jail for trying to cover up the mistakes the FBI had made during this case. As for the Weaver family, they were given a $3.1 million settlement by the government, and Kevin Harris had all charges dropped against him, and he won a 6-figure settlement. Of all the pictures that came out of Ruby Ridge, there's none more famous than this one taken by one of the surveillance teams of Vicky just before she was shot by that sniper. Scattered across the North American continent are many ghost towns, places that used to be vibrant and alive that are now dead and abandoned. In these places, you can find old churches and buildings and schools that are usually in a pretty significant state of decay. The reasons a town might die varies. Sometimes it's because a new railroad or highway is put in that bypasses the town, or the town has just exhausted all of their natural resources, which were the original draw to the town. Mining towns are a good example of that. Other reasons are wars, natural disasters, political wranglings. There's a whole bunch of reasons why towns just suddenly stop existing. But there's one ghost town in North America that has a really unique and very dark reason for why it ultimately was abandoned, and that town is Portlock, Alaska. Portlock, which is also called Port Chatham, is located on the farthest southwestern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. It's easily one of the most beautiful areas in all of Alaska, but it also happens to be very remote. And Portlock specifically, even by Kenai standards, is considered extremely remote. You can only get there by boat or by bush plane. The town was technically founded in 1787 when Captain Nathaniel Portlock of the Royal Navy landed there, but it wasn't really turned into a real settlement until the early 1900s when commercial fishermen built a cannery there. By 1921, the town's fishing economy was doing so well that the US government believed they would be the next major commercial fishing hub, and so they actually established a post office there. Everything seemed to be going great for Portlock until the 1930s when rumors began seeping out along the Kenai Peninsula that there was something wrong with Portlock. Men from this cannery town were going missing at an alarming rate, and the few that were found again were always found dead and mutilated in a nearby lagoon. Initially, the townspeople believed these were bear attacks, but the natives of the Kenai Peninsula that found out about what was happening in Portlock, they stopped by and they said, those are not bear attacks. Those are almost certainly attacks by a creature we call the Nantina, which means half man, half beast. And they are tall, two-legged, hairy creatures that live in the forest right near you. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore. But when you consider the fact that from 1930 to 1950, dozens of Portlock residents disappeared in that forest or were violently killed and then dumped in the lagoon right outside of the forest, it makes you wonder what's in the forest. But since none of the people who went missing were ever found alive again, there was never any good description of what it was that was causing them to disappear in the first place. Well, with the exception of one case. In 1943, John Meyer, who was a resident of Portlock, was at his campsite and he was crouched down when he felt something leap onto his back and start pummeling his head and hitting him on the side, and he kind of went into the fetal position, and then at some point his dog started barking and caused whatever was on his back to get scared and run off, and so John, who's been badly beaten, rolls over and he looks towards the tree line and he sees this enormous, tall, hairy man running into the woods. And so John gets up and he stumbles his way into town to try to get help, and he's able to tell someone what happened to him before he ultimately succumbs to his injuries and dies. After the John Meyer incident, another group of Portlock men were up in the forest doing some hunting when they discovered these enormous 18-inch long tracks, and they followed them to a clearing where it looked like there was this epic death struggle, that clearly two huge animals had gotten into a struggle here. There's blood everywhere, there's pieces of what looked like a bear or maybe a moose, and then these tracks continued out of this clearing and went right up the mountain, and the men did not dare follow those tracks to see whatever it was that emerged victorious in this clearing. Even the Alaskan newspapers began speculating that something was off about Portlock. This was more than just some crime being committed, that there's something happening there that we can't understand. And so by 1949, when people were still going missing mysteriously in the forest, and then other people were turning up dead and mutilated in the lagoon, the townspeople said, enough. This is an unsafe place to live. We don't know what's causing this, but we have to leave. And then practically overnight, the town evacuated, leaving behind most of their possessions. The only person that stayed a little bit longer was the postmaster, because he had to wait for the post office to be shut down. And he said it was horrifying that he would see things walking in the trees, and he would hear these horrible sounds, and so he was eager to get out of there. And so in early 1950, he was allowed to go, and then that was it. The population of Portlock went down to 0. After they left, none of the people from Portlock or any of their family members ever went back to Portlock. So the only people that have really ever gone back to Portlock are people that unfortunately wound up there, like in the 1970s when some fishermen got caught in a storm, and so they sought refuge in Portlock. But after setting up their camp, they saw something huge walk past them in the tree line, and it apparently was so terrifying that they literally packed up their camp, went back in their boat, and then went back out into the storm to avoid whatever it was they saw. Besides the fishermen, the only people that have gone to Portlock are people that want to come face to face with whatever it is that drove the people out of that town. But to put in perspective how few people do that, there's almost no modern photographs or videos of Portlock. But there is one very eerie modern photograph of this building that's right in the heart of Portlock. It's one of the very few buildings that didn't collapse, and it's located right next to the forest where many of the men who went missing were last seen. And it's also not far from the lagoon where many of the dead men and dead people that were taken were found. And even if you don't believe there's some Nantina running around the forests of Portlock, you have to understand that something was killing and taking these people in the forest that you are looking at right now. And to date, we still have no idea what it was, which means this is one of the creepiest pictures you will find on the internet. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please dress the like button in a realistic bear suit and then send them to the next Omante ritual in Japan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.